Today's video is brought to you by Oxedo LED lighting. You might think that you can see just fine at night. Well, I did too, until I did this little upgrade. As you can see from this footage, here is some before Oxedo LED lighting, and here is some after Oxedo LED lighting. The difference is amazing. With high brightness and easy installation, Oxedo LED lighting is definitely the route for you. They're easy to install, and they're available for all makes and models. Click on the link in the description below and enter promo code 612motorsports at checkout to get yourself 15% off. Now back to our video. Hello and welcome back to another episode of 612 Motorsports. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about 25 cars that will haunt GM for the rest of time. But before we get too far into today's episode, you guys know the routine. Please go ahead, hit that subscription button, the notification bell, leave a comment, a thumbs up, all that stuff. It's super helpful, and it's very greatly appreciated. All right, let's get into today's video. What do you say? General Motors is the largest car manufacturer in the world. Despite that reputation, many mistakes have been made along the way. The company has not been known for building the most reliable cars. Many company investments, have gone bust. Just look at the Saturn, for example. A brand in which GM spent millions of dollars researching and investing in the production of, only to be a thing of the past as the millennium came around. It's mistakes like that that have haunted the GM brand for decades. After coming out of bankruptcy, the brand is on an upward trajectory. But there are still many mistakes that the company continues to make when it comes to making cars that the people want. Today we're going to take a look back at some of the most obvious and lasting mistakes has made over the past few decades. Coming in at number 25, the Saturn L Series. The L Series marked what some believe to be the end for the Saturn brand. The car was everything that the brand was designed not to be. The L200 was bland, unreliable, and offered nothing in the way of value for the customer. The wagon version of the car was even worse, and Saturn was trying to position this car as a luxury option. The L200 didn't last that long on the market, selling from 1999 to 2004. Almost a decade after the L200 was released, Saturn was discontinued. When you think about a bland car, the L200 is about as bland as they come. Even as the model was discontinued in 2004, there were no tears spilled from the dealerships. Coming in at number 24, the Hummer H3 SUT. Released in the middle of an economic recession, there could not have been a worse SUV to hit the automotive market. To make things worse, the Hummer H3 SUT was based on an aged Chevrolet Colorado, which itself was nothing more than a rebadged Isuzu. The H3 SUT had nothing new to offer, and production numbers were so low that you'll seldomly see one on the road anymore. Shortly after this truck hit the market, the Hummer brand was disbanded altogether. Interestingly enough, GM would release the Hummer EV a decade later, which was similar to its outdated model in terms of styling. The Hummer brand will live on as a subdivision of the GMC brand and focus solely on EV models. Number 23, the Cadillac Catera. In the 1990s, the Cadillac brand was in the toilet. The cars being sold were outdated when you compare them to the upstart Lexus brand. Cadillac needed something that appealed to a younger demographic, and they attempted this with the Catera. The car was based on an existing Opel model sold overseas. The automotive press blasted the Catera for feeling cheap, lacking in style, and suffering from lethargic performance. The reliability of the car was questionable at best, and the styling alienated the traditional Cadillac buyer. Needless to say, the Catera was an ugly blemish on the long and storied history of Cadillac. Coming in at number 22, the GMC Envoy XUV. What happens when you take a Chevy Avalanche and put a camper shell on the back of it? You get an Envoy XUV. The SUV boom was in full swing in the early 2000s, and GM was trying to flood the market with different models. GMC sold a plethora of options at the time, but the XUV was unique. GM took the same formula used with the Chevy Avalanche and added a camper shell onto the back of it. The XUV could be turned into a camping tent on wheels and have the top of the rear removed for tall cargo. Although the sales numbers were never extraordinary, the GMC Envoy XUV developed a loyal following. Coming in at number 21, the Chevy Lumina. Bland passenger cars were fairly common in the 1990s, but perhaps no one did it better than GM. The company offered many bland cars offered across the entire brand portfolio. Perhaps the most boring of these was the Lumina. A car seemingly relegated to rental car fleets, the Lumina suffered from bland design and even worse performance. The build quality of GM vehicles around this period was not at its best. The Lumina did have a major presence in the NASCAR circuit for a short period before GM branded the two-door model as the Monte Carlo. Number 20, the Chevy Beretta. Similar to the plan Ford had with the Probe to replace the Mustang, the folks at GM also planned to replace the Camaro. By the late 1980s, the Camaro was riding on a dated design, and the top brass at GM thought the V8 powered sports car was on the way out. Beretta was the car that was going to change it all. It was lightweight and had a completely different design. On paper, the Beretta seemed like a good plan, but the reality was far from that. The car was based on the boring Chevy Corsica, which was nothing more than a rental fleet queen. Although the Beretta had some decent performance, it was not even close to the Camaro in terms of being a pony car. Enthusiasts didn't go for this ploy either, and by 1996 the Beretta was replaced by GM. Coming in at number 19, the Cadillac Escalade EXT. General Motors was looking to cash in on the bling bling fad of the early 2000s and the massive popularity of the Cadillac SUV. The model ended up being a sales success for GM in ways that many cars and SUV models hadn't. When the company decided to base an Escalade model on the Avalanche, things didn't go as well. Customers weren't willing to pay for a hybrid SUV with a shorter truck bed just to get an Escalade logo on it. Like most of the first luxury trucks attempts on the market, the sales for the Escalade were dismal. It was competing against the Lincoln Blackwood for a single year and then the Mark LT. Number 19, the Chevrolet Monte Carlo. Known affectionately among enthusiasts as the two-door Lumina, the 90s Monte Carlo was as bland as you could get. This was during a time when the GM design language wasn't the best, the build quality of the vehicles was not at its best, and the company introduced a questionable Monte Carlo. Released right on the heels of the excellent Impala SS, we have to wonder what GM was thinking. The Monte Carlo went from having a V8 power plant to a lethargic V6 engine that was about as performance-orientated as a Corolla. This generation of Monte Carlo will go down in history for being a questionable choice. Number 17, the Chevy Malibu. The General Motors Company as a brand in the 1990s was in a tough spot. The company was having massive success in the SUV market, but everywhere else the cars were substandard at best. Malibu is a prime example of how the company lost its footing to companies like Toyota and Honda. The subpar build quality of the Malibu when you compare it to a Honda or Toyota model was evident right off the bat. These cars were largely unreliable, drove like trash, and suffered from many quality issues. Nowadays, the Malibu from this generation frequents used car lots. Number 16, the Oldsmobile Cutlass Diesel. The Cutlass was one of the best-selling cars in the country when Oldsmobile was a prominent brand. Now it's nothing more than a relic of the past, which is a shame. The Cutlass was an excellent car model, and GM sold many of them during its run. But as fuel prices were soaring, GM was trying to build something unique, and thus the Cutlass Diesel was released. The problem with that car was that the diesel engine was faulty at best. These are known as some of the most unreliable GM cars to ever roll out of the GM factory. Number 15, the Pontiac Grand Prix GXP. The final generation of the Pontiac Grand Prix was a mere shadow of the former vehicle. The car had been a V6 powered vehicle for the last decade, and then GM decided to do something out of the ordinary. They took the old formula of cramming a monster V8 into a common car to make a performance vehicle. The only problem with that theory is that they used the Northstar V8, which wasn't a performance engine. The result is a V8 powered sports sedan that no one noticed, and it was discontinued shortly thereafter. While it was a unique novelty item, that was about it when it comes to the Grand Prix GXP. Coming in at number 14, the Chevrolet Corvette California 305. The 1970s were a strange time for automakers as they were put in a stranglehold by the new emissions regulations. GM was at the forefront of this problem, and they were releasing many cars to try to conform. The underpowered V8 engine was not what you'd expect in a performance car like the Corvette. Even to this day, the 305 V8 is considered one of the worst engines to come out of GM. The engine was paltry at best, and all of the emissions stuff that had to be bolted onto it didn't help things out either. Number 13, the Chevrolet HHR. The HHR is a car released too little too late by GM. Chrysler had released the PT Cruiser a good 6 years before GM released the HHR. The thought behind the retro-inspired wagon is that it would resonate with buyers. Well, the PT Cruiser did, and it sold quite well, but the HHR was nothing more than a carbon copy. GM tried to spice things up with the HHR panel version and the HHR SS, but this basic car wasn't that appealing. There was a global recession going on, and car shoppers just weren't looking to spend money on a novelty item. Questionable build quality for the HHR didn't make things much better either. Number 12, the Pontiac Fiero. The Fiero is actually the story of something that could have been great, but GM cut too many corners along the way. The car had every credential that it needed to compete with the Toyota MR2 on a high level, but when it came down to the design aspect of the Fiero, they were best questionable. Engine fires that took place early in the vehicle's life gave drivers a bad taste in their mouth. The Fiero would have had few revisions over time, but it wasn't enough to salvage the brand. Car shoppers were already leery of the Fiero, and GM decided to cancel production. Interestingly enough, the car has experienced a resurgence in the aftermarket, with used Fieros fetching thousands more than they were brand new. Number 11, the Chevrolet Aveo. After the Geo Metro was discontinued, GM needed something they could sell at a cheap price. GM had purchased the Daewoo brand a few years back, so it only made sense to grab from the existing parts bin. The Aveo was already being sold overseas as the Lanos, so GM imported it with little changes. While the car was light years ahead of the outgoing Chevy Metro, it wasn't by far. The Aveo had an extensive advertising campaign which touted the car's large interior volume and four-door design. There was also a sedan version, and the car sold well initially, but the reliability was substandard and the build quality of the car was even worse. Chevy would later replace the Aveo with the Sonic hatchback and sedan models. Coming in at number 10, the H2 Hummer. No vehicle has ever amplified the opalescence and greed of the early 2000s better than the Hummer H2. We all remember seeing these things when we were in school. They were everywhere, from the pickup line at the school to the music videos on VH1. The H2 became a cultural phenomenon, but the vehicle was also grossly overrated. The truck was based on the second generation Chevy Tahoe, and it was horrible on gas to boot. When the recession hit in 2007-2008, sales for the massive Hummer H2 all but evaporated completely. These things would have been a sales success nowadays, but back then it caused GM to shutter the entire Hummer brand. It should be noted that the unique Hummer H2 SUT was also released at the end of the vehicle's lifespan as well. Number 9, the Chevrolet Vega. Much like Ford's Pinto that came before it, the Chevrolet Vega was the product of a bygone era. Fuel prices were rising at such a rapid rate that automakers had to respond fast with downsized vehicles. The Vega was about as cheap as possible with a build quality worse than any other GM vehicle ever made. People were stunned by how cars were beginning to change, and the Vega was at the forefront of this cheap revolution. One of the many things people remember about the Vega is how unreliable it was. The car would routinely be stuck on the side of the road, and if driving didn't kill the car, the road elements would. Coming in at number 8, the Oldsmobile Aurora. There was a time when the Oldsmobile brand was one of the most influential in the automotive industry. But those times had changed by the 1990s, and GM needed to revitalize the brand. The Aurora was to launch a completely new and unique luxury brand similar to Toyota with its Lexus. The automotive press was impressed with the initial quality of the Aurora, and it received high praise. But in the latter part of the 1990s, the sales for the sedan had cooled off, and the second generation was nothing more than a fancier Buick model. The car lost everything that made it unique and quickly killed Oldsmobile off in 2004. Few cars experienced as short and sweet as a run as the Aurora. Coming in at number 7, the Chevrolet Tracker. This little SUV that could. The Tracker was released after GM had closed the Geo brand and combined it with Chevrolet. The second generation Tracker was built in partnership with Suzuki, and the thing was a carbon copy of the Vitara. There is little difference between the two SUVs other than the fact that the Chevy was more well known. The Tracker was an authentic SUV with four-wheel drive capabilities, but the build quality was paltry at best, and the reliability was even more questionable. The Tracker was sold for a while in many configurations. There wasn't a lot to like about these things, and it was eventually discontinued. Nowadays, everyone is rushing to buy a used SUV, and the Tracker has experienced a massive rise in value. Coming in at number 6, the Saturn SC. The three-door sports coupe was supposed to be revolutionary. The Saturn brand as a whole was supposed to be revolutionary. Sadly, as time went on, GM stopped caring about the brand and the car models became bland. The SC was heavily advertised as a revolutionary three-door coupe in the early 2000s, but when you got behind the wheel, the car was nothing more than your run-of-the-mill Saturn. The performance wasn't very impressive, and the design of the car was bland. The SC would sell upon the Ion Coupe. The performance wasn't very impressive, and the design of the car was bland. The SC would sell until the Ion Coupe replaced it. The brand never recovered from these blunders, and by the late 2000s, Saturn was on the chopping block. It's a sad state of affairs considering the brand was supposed to spark a revolution. Coming in at number 5, the Buick Century. The Century is another car that sort of languished with GM in the 90s. The car was a cheap entry-model Buick, which is fair enough, but when you're trying to market something as a premium brand, the car should be better put together. The design of the Century was cheap at best, and the car shared almost all of its sheet metal with the Regal. Buick would continue to sell the Century for quite some time, and this was usually the first thing you'd see at the rental car place. The Century was one of those vehicles that tarnished the Buick reputation, and it has been a tough climb back ever since. The GM cars from this era were definitely on the bland side of things. Coming in at number 4, the Pontiac Grand Am. By the 1990s, the Pontiac brand had gone from being renowned for performance to being the home of rebadged GM car models. The Grand Am of the 90s was a prime example of this. The cheaply designed little car was notoriously unreliable, difficult to work on, and cramped to ride in. There was nothing particularly good about this generation of Grand Am. Sales numbers were reasonable, but the car never became a breakout success. Even in the used car market, these things are only worth a few $100s. You can't find one in good shape anymore as they've all been beaten to pieces. Number 3, the Buick Riviera. The Riviera is a prime example of something done right with the wrong execution. The Riviera was a great car in almost every aspect, aside from the engine design. The Riviera was notoriously difficult to work on, which meant the repair bills for this thing were through the roof. To do something as simple as change the rear spark plugs, the entire engine had to be hoisted forward. GM did not do auto repair shops any justice in the design of this vehicle, and the same can be said for the customer. These cars are quite desirable nowadays, but you are going to spend quite a bit to keep it on the road. The fact that the maintenance is so difficult makes Riviera a car to avoid altogether. Coming in at number 2, the Oldsmobile Silhouette. General Motors was the first company to offer a complete luxury minivan, at a time when there wasn't even a market for one. The Silhouette had a great concept, but the design was so ugly that no one wanted to drive it. These vans were dubbed the Dustbuster, and GM had a tough time forcing them on consumers. Surprisingly enough, the Silhouette would continue to be sold for almost a decade later. There was a lot to like on the interior of the van, but when it came to the exterior, you couldn't drive something that was uglier. The Silhouette was one of the last Oldsmobile models ever sold. And coming in at number 1, the Pontiac Transport. Not only did GM try to force consumers to buy the first luxury minivans, the company also built the first sports minivan, the Transport, which also heavily advertised earlier as an alternative to the boring minivan. Everyone would always try to overthrow Chrysler at this point, but the Dodge Caravan and the Plymouth Voyager were the standard barriers when it comes to the minivan. The Transport didn't sell that well either due to its ugly styling. GM did well in the fleet sales world, which is why you saw so many of these at the airport and in the taxi cabs. The Transport will be one of the most questionable design decisions GM ever made on a brand. I used to have a Pontiac Transport. I loved the thing. Yes, it was ugly, but I'm telling you, the way it was shaped and designed, I could go through a head-on wind with zero problem, and it was a nice flat back so the wind would push from the back, and I'd get excellent gas mileage all around. Very sweet ride. If you're road tripping, that kind of thing, perfect. Other than that, it's another minivan. But those are a few vehicles that will haunt GM for the rest of time. I hope you learned a little something. I disagree with a few of those, but that's just what I found. Is a little article, and I thought I'd share it with you. Let me know if you've had any of those cars and what your thoughts are on them. As always, stay positive, work hard, and make it happen.